Disability Education in Society podcast. This is a podcast for collective learning and unlearning in the struggle for intersectional liberation. We focus on educational realms, expanding to other societal areas. We share our stories as academics as well as those of our featured guests, including disability activists involved with multifaceted dimensions of systems equity, self-determination efforts, anti-ableist, and anti-racist liberation. Join us as co-conspirators.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Disability Education and Society podcast. In this episode, I'm going to continue the presentation that I had in the last episode. This is the companion episode, as I called it before. However, it's not necessary that you view the previous episode before you engage with this particular episode. But I think it's helpful if you wanted to get into some of the groundwork for this particular presentation. This, again, is a practical presentation, if you will. So this is one way that I think we can practice abolitionist math practices. And in this case, we're going to be looking at a unit planning tool that I have utilized in my courses at the teacher education settings for a few semesters. And I'm going to share some of that work in this presentation. So again, you can get a sense and some thinking around what abolitionist math unit planning could look like. Again, this is one way. There are many infinite ways to go about doing abolitionist practices. And as I think in keeping the notion that was shared in the previous presentation, and I'll kind of reintroduce some of those ideas here in this presentation as well, so that if you're coming in to this episode for the first time, you could get a summary of what I shared in the previous presentation. Okay, so one important point that I want to make here is that abolitionist, I think abolitionist practice has a bigger vision, if you will, a bigger drive than just typically what happens in the mathematics classrooms. And I'm going to be talking a lot in this presentation about in the context of elementary math classrooms with children, but it doesn't have to be contained to that particular context. It could easily be done in other contexts as well, such as middle, secondary level, and I think even in post-secondary levels as well. What I think is important is that it connects in a lot of ways to this larger struggle, and this is a larger freedom struggle, if you will, that the work that I am proposing here has a connection to issues of intersectional issues. So it does focus a lot on disabilities, but we know that disability is intricately tied with race and racism. So ableism and racism are interconnected, as I'll talk a little bit more about in this presentation, as well as its connections to larger systems of oppression. So talk about racism, talk about sexism, we talk about settler colonialism, talk about capitalism. All these systems of oppression are interconnected. And so this concrete work that I'm going to share today, I aim to have it connect to these larger conversation, contribute to these larger global struggle. And And why? I mean, it's about freedom, it's about enriching, it's about lives. And so I think living lives that fulfill purpose beyond just like ways that you could contribute to a someone's bottom line, or somebody's profits. I mean, those things are, again, things that in previous episode we talked about Marxism and communism. I mean, all these things that I think are connected to some of the whys, if you will, of, well, why do this work? Why connect elementary math to these larger issues? And one reason is that because it's connected, it is inherently connected, and the work of disrupting these systems of oppression can be done in particular spaces. And in this presentation, I'm going to share one of those spaces. Okay, so this is a quote that I read in the last presentation that I'll read again, because I think it's important to note how I am approaching abolition in this context. I mean, there have been a lot of folks who've done so much awesome work with abolition, and I'm really just kind of thinking about that and building upon that and applying that in a particular context. Again, this is elementary math methods, in focusing on what I feel are one of the most marginalized groups, which are disabled students of color. So this quote is by Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who is a prominent prisonist, abolitionist scholar, thinker, and I think this quote captures well how I'm approaching abolition. So here's a quote. Abolition is not absence, it is presence. What the world will become already exists in fragments and pieces, experiments and possibilities. So those who feel in their gut deep anxiety that abolition means knock it all down, scorch the earth, and start something new, let that go. Abolition is building the future from the present in all of the ways we can. So again, this idea of building from what we have is really at the essence of this unit planning tool. Like we have some things in that we utilize every day, if you will, that we approach every way, in many in much of our work as teacher educators, as classroom teachers, as school administrators. And so this is a tool that I think if we can think about it in very radical, in radically different ways, I think can approach some abolitionist type of work. And here I share a figure, and again, this I didn't note this earlier, but this is, if you're engaging with this via a podcast, audio only, then I'm really sharing a presentation as well. So this is like a Google slide presentation with some figures, with some text. I'm, as much as possible, I'm trying to make that accessible via those who are just engaging audio. However, there is a YouTube version where you can also view both the audio and the video of this episode, so that you can see some of the ideas in the visual format. So in this slide, what I have is what I am pulling together in the ideas that I'm pulling together for the basis of this work. So I went to really in deep detail about this in the previous episode. So in this episode, I'm just gonna really highlight and summarize as briefly, as succinctly as I can, some of the ideas that underpin this math unit planning tool. And so the big idea is that when we unit plan, when we lesson plan, the typical way of doing that is thinking about, okay, most, right, a teacher, a math teacher might say, well, this lesson, I'm thinking about most of my students. So the typical middle of the average student, whatever you think, most of my students in the classroom. And then what I could do is kind of tinker to make sure I could maybe use the term differentiate for the so-called higher level students, and then differentiate for the so-called lower level students. I mean, that's kind of a dominant way of approaching unit planning, lesson planning. However, the idea that I'm proposing here, which is aligned to prison abolition and what some of the works that I've also drawn from desinstitutionalization, is this idea of like, let's center the ones that we have the most challenges in so-called reaching. And so in the case that I'm really particularly focused on are students with profound and severe disabilities, if you will, because those are the students we first, they might not even be in most of our mathematics classroom. They might be taught or segregated in separate spaces, and if they are even included in general education classrooms, they're still sort of in the margins, and the unit might be differentiated, or accommodation modifications might be made after the fact of a teacher planning the lesson or the unit around their average student. And so the graphic here really talks about, let's center those who are the most difficult to think about, to teach, to plan for. I mean, and so this is again turning this idea of lesson planning on its head, and centering those who are most marginalized. And this is very much aligned with prison abolitionist ways of thinking. And so that's, I think, one way to go about that. Okay, so the other ideas here is that the abolitionist tenets of intersectionality, again, talked a little bit about disabled students, or disabled students of color, as something that we have to take seriously in this work, and this immediacy. So this immediacy component of abolitionists is that we have to take care of this now. And the unit planning math tool, I think, is a way of doing that. Let's say if we center those who are most marginalized, we are ensuring that we are making the work about them, removing them from harmful spaces that they are currently in, the kinds of mathematics that they're engaged in, the kinds of dehumanization that happens when they are what I call in these, what I think of as sites of incarceration, which are segregationist spaces that they have very little engagement with rich, meaningful, connected, important kinds of mathematics. And so I think that's kind of the immediacy component, and imagining. And again, these are things that we don't currently have. And so it's important as abolitionists to think about creating these. And I think that the unit planning tool is one way of imagining, because it's a creation of going of an abolitionist kind of creation. And then this is another aspect of this too, is the idea of disability studies in math education, which is some of the work that I've been doing for the last few years, which talk about the mathematics of all students. And so when we think about most math classrooms, we tend to have the so-called normal students, the non-disabled, and even if there are disabled students in math spaces, in general education math spaces, they tend to be those who most approximate those who are normal. And so there is a need, an importance of engaging in the variety of mathematics that is not just something that we value in schools, but perhaps we can broaden our scope of what math is and understand math and understand how different people, because we all as humans engage in mathematics in various ways. And so the mathematics of all is an important aspect of this abolitionist work to counter that only certain kinds of math count, that only certain kinds of math are valuable, that only certain ways of knowing and doing math are important. And so that's the disability studies in math education perspective, which counters this deficit view of disabilities. And so it really is grounded in this field of disability studies in education, and it kind of takes on this mathematics approach to thinking about disabilities and how that can be a source of knowledge, and which is the third aspect of this slide, which is disepistemologies, as Liat Ben-Moshe talks about. In this case, what I'm thinking about here is how students who are severely and profoundly disabled and are of color are abolitionist math endurers. So they can and they should lead the way in thinking about these sort of new ways of mathematics education engagement in elementary schools. So this is kind of, again, the basis of the tool that I'm going to be sharing today. And I talked a little bit about the models of disabilities, and here I just have a table of the different kinds of models. The medical model, which I talked about, is very much a deficit-oriented model of disability, where the focus is on fixing, remediating students to fit the norm, if you will. So again, what I'm problematizing here as abolitionists is to think about what is the norm, like who's at the center, and so who's included, who's excluded. So those are the ways that abolitionists kind of ways of thinking kind of help push back against the medical model. And in a shift from the medical model, there's also a social model where then we can think about the problem of disabilities as not focused on individuals or located with individuals, but as located within systems as well. There's also a political model of disability, a political relational model that Alison Kafer talks about, which I have not included here, but I feel like that's more of an abolitionist kind of fit, if you will, into that location. So, I mean, this table really gets into a lot of details about the differences between the different models of disability. And again, in this presentation and in the math unit planning tool, I'm really trying to approach this abolitionist model of disability, which is, again, intersectional, which is about immediacy, which is about imagination, and really takes seriously this notion of Liat Ben-Moshe's idea of disepistemologies, the ways that disabilities provides a rich set of knowledges that are important in all spaces, and in one space that we haven't thought about much about disability knowledges is the mathematics education spaces. And so this is sort of the way this particular tool is, again, approaching the abolitionist model. So I talked about this work. I've been doing this work mostly in elementary math context with elementary math pre-service teachers. I've done it in several of the institutions that I worked for. But again, I don't want to limit that just to elementary. I think those who engage in this podcast will, I think there might be ideas that spark, oh, I could do this in other contexts as well. I do want to focus on elementary because it does provide a particular context of this work, the importance of doing this work in the elementary setting, because one, I mean, there are many reasons. Like I'm just going to talk about three here in particular, is the importance of identity formation. So we know children form their math identity early on in their lives, particularly as they go to school. Identity of math that maybe, well, I'm good at math, or I'm not good at math, or I don't have a lot of trepidations about math. So all these sort of affective ways of thinking about math that then they carry on to adulthood is formed at the elementary context in the elementary school. And this goes for teachers too, who then are going to be working with children. And so in my decades, over a decade of working as a teacher educator focused on elementary mathematics, I've come across teachers, many of whom have talked about their feelings about math, and much of that, those feelings and identities tend to be negative. I mean, you have a variety, of course, of teachers, particularly elementary, but I think I've come across many teachers who said that I'm not good at math. I'm scared to teach math. I don't know how I'm going to teach math, and they want to become elementary teachers. And so again, a lot of the source of those identities form early on. So that's important to think about both children and teachers in this work. So the abolitionist tool will, I think, in many ways address some of those things. So not only are teachers rethinking about unit planning, but they're also rethinking about their own mathematics competence, if you will, or identity, or they're questioning, saying, well, why do I feel that way? And how do we counter that? And the tool, I think, helps us think about that a little bit more. The other part about elementary math is students are very curious. Children are very curious about a lot of things. Injustice is one, math is another. However, in too many math classrooms, elementary level, those curiosities tends to be squashed, unfortunately. And so it's important, right, to think about how we can foster curiosity, to keep that curiosity going as long as we can, rather than squash it, like I mentioned earlier. And then the other aspect is this idea of inclusivity. And so when we talk about elementary math, we often think about these as spaces of belonging. And I think teachers and administrators and teacher educators are all for inclusivity. However, when we think about the particular population that I'm going to be talking about in this presentation, the severe and profound children, then where are they part of this inclusivity? Is there a line drawing where we are inclusive up to a point, which means that there is a level of exclusion? And so this is, again, to challenge and to disrupt this notion that, yes, we are inclusive, and we are being exclusive at the same time. And so I think that's, again, importance of this context to think about this work.
Hi there. While we intend to make our podcast as accessible as possible, we ask those that have the financial means to support us by subscribing as a patron to our podcast for as little as $5 a month. To subscribe, go to our website, disabilityed.podbean.com. By subscribing as a patron, you will help ensure that we can continue to create and share new episodes while supporting other co-conspirators who face financial and health difficulties. For those with financial difficulties, please connect with us about obtaining a free copy of our books and/or engaging in additional conversations with us. You can also support this show by hitting the follow button. Share this podcast with among your network and leave us a comment and positive rating. Your support means so much.
Okay, so I'm going to get ready to share the tool. I been holding out for a long time, providing a lot of the context and the background for the tools, and so I think it's important I think it's important that I laid out some of that groundwork before we get to the tool, and just a little bit more information about the context of my work. I've done this a lot in this particular course. The most recent is it's titled Elementary Math Methods, Inclusive Setting 2. And so these are prospective teachers who are aiming to become elementary teachers, and they have a focus on either students who receive special education services or multilingual learners. So that's the program that I'm part of. However, I've done this, as I mentioned, in other institutions, both at the elementaries and secondary level, with very similar sort of a way of thinking about an abolitionist approach to unit planning. In this most recent context, most of the pre-service or prospective teachers are white, female, middle class. And in this particular program, this is an online course. And so this, again, thinking about doing this very complicated work, right? Think about doing this online in an asynchronous format. This is a big challenge, as many teacher educators and those who are being preparing to be teachers might imagine, like, well, you want us to do this in this kind of setting. And so that's just to say that, just to provide a little context. But I will say, though, like, just sort of like as outcomes wise, there have been some really outstanding ways that prospective teachers have been doing this. And so they've been creating this. I've been asking a lot of them to do a lot of complexities. And in many cases, they have come through with some things that I've just been very pleased with. And so that's not to say it's an easy thing that's going to magically happen, but it's to say that prospective teachers have this drive to do this work, and they have to have these opportunities to think about abolitionist practices. That's kind of the bottom line here that I'm proposing. So the tool, here it is. It's really not like fancy in ways of thinking. I mean, it's just really different, if you will. Like, how do we approach unit planning? And so there are three components of the unit planning tool. One component is the focus student and their context. This is a study that I have prospective teachers engage in. Layered goals is the second component, and the third component is math task and lesson plans. Okay. So and what I'm going to share in the coming what's upcoming are sort of the details of these components. So the first component is the focus students and their context. And so what I asked prospective teachers to do is to, one, work in small groups, because the complexity of this work requires a lot of collaboration, a lot of sense making, a lot of sort of having others to kind of talk out some of these ideas and to share, which I think, again, is a helpful way to approach this unit plan. Doing it alone I think, is really difficult in many ways. Again, just given the amount of thinking, of creativity, of trying to make sense of some of these concepts. So the focus and context study is really just thinking about or having prospective teachers think about one student in their particular setting. So in our program at this stage in their program, prospective teachers are in classrooms. They're not teaching, they're really observing in most cases at this junction in the program. And so what I asked them to do is to pick one student who can be identified, or their host teacher identify as having severe or profound disability. Now, in most cases, this student is not going to be part of this general education classroom. Again, these are teachers who are in general education classrooms. They also may spend some time in special education classrooms, but most of them don't focus on students with severe and profound disability. So this might take some kind of having conversations in their schools with teachers about, like, is there a student that I can observe, that I can learn more about, because this is a student that's going to be a focus of this unit plan. They're going to be central. We're going to center this student. And to do that, we're going to have to learn about the student. And so this is the focus student, learning about them, learning about the focus students in complex ways. Again, this idea of disepistemologies to counter these medical model deficit of students that might just say, well, they have these math gaps, they can't do this, right? They can't do this, they can't count, they can't recognize numerals. I mean, all these sort of deficit ways, that's not what this focus study is about. It is about learning the complex nature of the student in complex way, including their brilliances, their ways of thinking, their ways of engaging in mathematics. So countering a lot of the ways that what typically happens in schools, which is, well, this is their test score, this is what I observed that they can't do, this is where I determine that they lack skills. And so those are things that absolutely it can be included in the focused student study. However, I ask prospective teachers to go much beyond that, and to think about a complex intersection understanding and the mathematics of. Okay, so this is, again, this idea of this epistemology is coming through here, the math of, because you as prospective teachers have to learn about how students are knowing and doing math. Again, the assumption is that everyone is powerful math knower and doers. However, that could be differently sort of manifest, if you will. And so this is important. And also important here is not just looking at the focused student, but also their context, thinking about how maybe some of the ways that the context of being in a separate environment has been hindering that student. What kinds of math is going on? So this Ben Mouchet talks about disablement, and so the disablement of mathematics learning also is happening here because students aren't provided opportunities. They haven't been provided. Let's say you had students in the third grade and they've been in segregated settings, falling, if you will, falling further and further behind, or engaging in a math curriculum that is perhaps grade levels behind, or focus only on skills. And so these are sort of contexts of this study that I ask prospective teachers to engage in, that can bring and shed some further information about what's going on here, who's this focus students, what's been going on, what are some again, this idea of social model of disability, what are some of the ways that the system has been the system is broken in many ways. It's disabling. So this social abolitionist model of disability. So that's the first component that prospective teachers engage in. And a little bit more about the course is that in my course, as you may imagine, that I start the course by doing a lot of work with what I just done here in this presentation, is to provide some of the critical aspects of how we approach disabled students in schools, and have some theories and frameworks that we engage in with prospective teachers prior to them doing this work. So in other words, what I'm saying is that prospective teachers have had a lot of, at this point, have had a lot of engagement with some of these inequities, injustice, abolitionist kind of thinking prior to them having to engage in, and while they're engaging in this exercise or practice or the ask that I'm putting on them. So this is in many ways not new to them, but they're just trying to make sense of what they've done up to this point in their course. And I also mentioned that this is a second course. This is a second of two elementary inclusive mathematics elementary course that they take, and so they, in most cases, they would have had me as the instructor for the first course. And so we're building on some of those foundation pieces. And so as you could see, it takes quite a bit of time and engagement and thinking and collaborating with others to even kind of get you this point. So what I'm saying here is that this tool is not something that you could just say, oh, I'm just going to take this tool, I'm going to just put it out there and have my prospective teachers engage in, because there's a lot of sort of background information that, or you call it front loading, that has to be done to be able to get to this point. At the same time, I'll say that I haven't tried it with sort of prospective teachers who have not had it. So it might be possible that they might come up with some creative ways, and so your context will be different than mine. I'm just sort of providing some ideas here and sharing a concrete example of how I could do. I think abolitionist practice can work with prospective elementary teachers, and again, abolitionist practices vary and can be done in many different contexts, in many different ways. And again, this is just one way of doing that. All right, so the next component, so we have the focus student, we have the context with let go sort of side by side with the focus student, and then the other component of the unit planning is the goals. So the layered goals, and this is important because it's what I shared earlier really has prospective teachers think about how all of the things that are happening in this unit plans align to some of the goals. So they have to lay out some goals, and I have different layers here. So this figure sort of describes the different layers, and the goals go from broad goals. So you can think about equity, abolitionist goals, and that may not necessarily focus directly on math in this way, in this at first, but it's saying like, this is what's like, as a small group of prospective teachers, this is what we want to focus on in this unit plan. This is a layer one goal. These are our equity goals, if you will. And so the tool has many examples, and just for not having so much text in here, and it's still a lot of text anyways, I've just captured one or two examples here. But so an example of a layer one goal is to focus on and with marginalized students and what they and their community bring into the classroom. So honoring their identity, lived experiences, and culture, drawing on cultural and indigenous practice as gender resources. So students, prospective teachers might say, okay, that's it. That's the goal I want, the layer one goal I want to go with. Okay, so the layer one goal component is really just to select the goals, to say, this is what I'm going for, or they may have other ideas. So, I have, again, a list of possibilities for each layer, and they select from that list, or they could say, well, we as a group thought about this as a layer one goal. And I say, well, yeah, that does kind of fit within these ethos of a layer one goal. So go for it. And so again, this is just, I throw out some ideas of what kind of goals can be classified in each layer. So layer one is equity goals. Layer two gets into the mathematics, but it's still not at this just a skill level, if you will, but it's still abolitionist mathematics education goals. So some examples of that could be reframe from students need mathematics to mathematics need students. Okay, so that's an abolitionist goal, maybe anti sort of neoliberal kind of thinking, if you will. And we could talk about that at some other juncture in this podcast, but it really is about going against. I loved how one prospective teacher talked about like this mathematics unit planning tool. They said, yeah, this is really just going against the grain. And I was like, yeah, you captured that really well, because I mean, I think we could have just maybe I could have just started that with this presentation with, that's what this tool is about. It's about going against the grain. So there, again, layer two are abolitionist mathematics education goals. Another example could be positioning students as powerful mathematics knowers and doers, having multiple ways of knowing and doing, neurodiversity. Again, these are still larger goals, right? And they're not specific to standards, if you will, which is actually the next layer. So now we get to the standards. And so, again, just thinking about what this unit plan tool is, right? You look at the focus student, you have their context, and you start, right? You center not only the student, you center like abolitionist equity goals. That's the center of your unit. And then you get into what we traditionally start with first, right? We start with, okay, what are the standards? Or in case of students who receive special education services, what are their IEP goals, or individualized education program goals? And then they start to think about everything else. So this, again, unit plan, hopefully I'm making it apparent here that this is different in the ways of what is centered. What is centered are profound and severe disabled students of color, and what is centered is abolition and equity goals. And then we get into layer three, which is the state standards. And that's, again, for most teachers and most teacher educators, that's pretty much part and parcel with the work that you do, which is, okay, what are the state standards that we have to ensure it reaches. So this is not until layer three. So this, again, is later, and then layer four then gets into the maybe IEP goals, so individualized education program goals. Okay, so that's kind of the layer goals component. So they have the focus student, they have the context of the focus students, they have the layer goals, and then we get into the more nitty gritty of the unit, if you will. So it's very broad, starts very broad, big ideas, and then this is where the details come in. This unit plan is really in many ways. There's a theme, right? There's a title, there are central questions in most unit plans. They last a few weeks, maybe a month or more, and they're really consisting, right, of a series of lessons. I mean, that's how I think about unit planning. And there are some big ideas there as well. And so what I ask prospective teachers to do is to, in their unit plan, is to think about several lessons, right? Let's say, in this case, what I have here in the Google slide is a set of 6 lessons, and just provide an overview of the lesson, like what's this lesson about. Lesson 1 is about this, right? Lesson 2 is about this. So this is a lesson planning, but it's not maybe what most of folks are used to with like lesson plan template, because it doesn't have that flavor. It just has sort of like some still at a big idea approach, and then talk about the lesson, talk about how it connects to the focus student, and how it connects to the layer goals. And then there are other principles, again, that we talk a lot about in the course. We talk about universal design for learning. We talk about culturally responsive and sustaining practices. And we talked about this idea of this epistemology. So this unit plan is like a culmination of so many things that we've been learning in the course. Talk about abolitionist tasks. There are not many mathematics tasks out there that exist that are explicitly abolitionist. So this is, again, another aspect of creation. So we know that there are really math tasks that are varying degrees of quality wise. And so then if we have a high quality math task, now we got to think about like abolitionists, or we could also think about an abolitionist task, and how is that a high quality math task. So again, a lot of creation, a lot of thinking, a lot of sort of ways to approach abolitionist practices. And again, this is one way with this unit planning tool that has prospective teachers engage in unit planning in ways that are very counter to how we traditionally approach unit planning in many ways, in how we think about equity goals and how we think about relatedly students who are often marginalized, who are often the most marginalized in mathematics education, and then ask prospective teachers to put all this together in a way that is tightly aligned. Now that you may see so many challenges with this kind of work, and I agree that there are many challenges with this work. But as I mentioned earlier, that there are also so many great things that have come out as well. And so this is, again, one concrete way to think about that I offer as an abolitionist mathematics practice, and in particular to this type of in the unit planning sort of approach. So just to close this presentation, I just want to highlight again that this is one way of many to think about abolitionist practices, and also to highlight the power of educators. And this is in the context of prospective teachers. I've been just amazed by what has come out, because um, as in prison abolitions, a lot of the like alternatives, if you will, as many prison abolitionists will talk about, the alternatives do not exist, right? What is the alternative to prisons? Well, they don't actually exist. We have to create them. So this is very similar. This parallels this idea that what we're doing here with this unit plan, it doesn't exist. So I'm asking prospective teachers to create it. So when they create it, it surprises me because I haven't seen it. So like, wow, yeah. I mean, this really is abolitionist in many ways, but this is not done, right? Like they're not just going to say, okay, we got together over the weekend, we knocked out this abolitionist unit plan. No, that's not the case. There's a lot of conversation, there's a lot of frustration, there's a lot of moments in space of uncertainty. And again, that's a lot of what abolitionist work is about, which is sort of sitting in that space of like, oh, like I really don't know what I'm doing here, which is it's an important part of creating these alternatives. And so the powers of educators and solidarities is huge, and has been important. And this is not to say that everybody or every prospective teacher or every small group that I do this has gotten to that point. It is to say that they have moved in many ways. So they are going from this medical model of disability to a more social abolitionist model. Again, it's going to vary it has varied from group to group. But overall, like everybody, I say has moved, right? They're not thinking about sort of a traditional way of approaching unit planning. They're not thinking about, oh, we're going to center the normal. We're not going to destabilize the center, which is what abolition is about. It's about recentering, decentering, destabilizing the center, putting those who are at the margins at the center. And so that approach, I think, is already something that is a practice that's important. So there's no prescription. I mean, it may seem like there's a prescription. What I've outlined here may be prescribing, and that may be sort of an issue that I have to maybe think more about. But I'm hoping that there's not a prescription, just like abolitionist practice. There's not a prescription to how to do abolitionist practices, and that might be the most frustrating part of this. Because many prospective teachers have that expectation. It's like, okay, tell me how to teach math. And we do that, right? As teachers, educators, we say, okay, yeah, here's a lesson plan template. Here's how you could do it. And so we sort of perpetuate that in many ways. But and maybe I've perpetuated that in this presentation as well. But I do want to emphasize that there is no prescription, right? There's no like step 1, step 2, step 3. Here's what you do to do this work. There are ideas, right? There are values, there are ethics that are important, yes, but there are no prescription. And then the last part is that ableism in math education is severe and profound. So a lot of interrogating your biases about disabilities has to be, and it comes up so much in this work. Well, students can't do this. Well, they can't identify these numbers, right? They don't know these things. So, I mean, those kind of expressions come up a lot. And again, this is not something that we blame prospective teachers or teachers who are practicing. It is very systemic. We are made to think about this, about disability, and again, how it connects to other systems of oppressions like racism and sexism and imperialism. I mean, all these things are interconnected. So, but ableism is super um, is super prevalent in the context of math education. And so why elementary math is that we can start challenging that ableism in these spaces in the work that we do. So that's again a way to think about abolitionist practice in elementary context. One idea, and again, I'm gonna close this presentation by evoking Liat Ben-Moshe again, because this idea of immediacy is super important. Because if we think about, we know children right now are being harmed in education. They're being harmed in math education, and so math education, we cannot wait for alternatives. because they do not exist, and because we need to stop the immediate harm that's happening right now. All right, well, that is the presentation for the companion presentation to the one that I shared in the previous episode. And in the previous episode, I invited others who want to engage in more conversation about this to reach out to Alexis Padilla or I, and we would love to have additional conversation. This was a presentation that I had at Purdue University, and just really capture some of the thinking of my more recent thinking, as well as the work that I've been doing. But again, this work it shouldn't be done in isolation. Although this presentation is just me, this work needs to have a lot of dialogue. And so it's important that, and again, we invite you all to have this conversation with us, share what you're thinking, share some of the questions you have, some of the critiques, of course, as well, because this is still work in formation. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much for engaging with the DES podcast. We post new episodes every few weeks. The DES podcast is made possible and sustainable in solidarity with you and those who generously volunteer their time to converse with us. We hope you join us on our next episode.